To start at the Mary Junck Colloquium for this semester, what do I say about Dave? So Dave's obviously here to talk about his new book, The MoveOn Effect, The Unexpected Transformation of American Political Advocacy. It is a book that I think has broken new ground in terms of thinking about the effect of the internet on what Dave calls the organizational layer of American politics. So how the internet is reshaping the ways in which interest groups function, the way that they mobilize citizens, the way that they make claims on political actors and elected officials, and the new sets of intermediaries that are very involved in shaping the forms of contemporary citizenship online and offline, because as Dave argues, they feed into one another as a new set of tactics and repertoires. Dave and I go way back now, which we just were reminiscing a bit about lunch. Dave did a PhD in political science at the University of Pennsylvania, and he was a pre-doctoral fellow at the Miller Center of Public Affairs at Virginia. After that, he was a postdoc at Brown University's Taubman Center for Public Policy, and then really where Dave and I first started to intersect, cross paths, and really debate many of the ideas that are in both of our books was when Dave was a postdoctoral fellow at Yale's Information Society Project, when I was a fellow there as well. After that, Dave went on to become an assistant professor at Rutgers and is currently an assistant professor in the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. I'm delighted to introduce Dave. I think Dave is one of the important new young voices in terms of really writing and researching the effect of the internet on democracy and citizenship more generally. So, Dave.
Thanks. Thanks, Daniel. Oh, I'm going to turn this a little bit if I can. Do we know how to... So I can do it? Yeah.
Good?
Yes, thanks. It's a real pleasure to be here. Daniel, thanks for bringing me out. Daniel and I have sort of been doing a roving book tour over last semester and this semester. We, I think, traded visits at Stanford, missing each other by like half a week, which is appropriate because this is a much, much better book specifically because of his input. That year at Yale, we were both living at...
It's a better book than his?
No, it's a better... Excellent question, and one that we should all debate. No, it's a much finer book than it would otherwise have been. We were both living in Brooklyn during that year at Yale, which meant that every time I went out to Yale, I got, along with an excellent intellectually enriching conversation at Yale, about 5 hours of train time where he and I would debate every square inch of intellectual terrain. And I am so much the better for it. And it's a real joy to be here today and talk with you all about what resulted. A little bit more background on the project. Before I entered academia, I was a political organizer myself. I got involved with the Sierra Club, the oldest and largest environmental group in the country, partially actually at the urgings of Robbie Cox, who is emeritus in the communications department here. But I got involved with them when I was 16 years old. They have a student-run arm called Sierra Student Coalition, and I was the national director of that in 1999 and 2000, and then went on to serve on the Sierra Club's board of directors from 2004 to 2010, which coincided with being in grad school. We have some graduate PhD students in the room, so a word of advice to all of you: don't join a national board while you are in graduate school. I do not recommend it. I know you were all considering offers, but just pass those for now. Yeah, I know. Like the nice thing is there's so many offering that if you say no to all of them, they won't be offended. So that's good. But so I came to the study of the internet through at first the study of politics and trying to understand American political institutions and how and when they change, and along the way noticing that more and more are the things that I understood as an organizer, the edges of them were getting played with, and it was because of the internet and the things that was making possible that we couldn't do before. The Dean campaign in 2003 being sort of the first obvious input to this, where people were doing things using the internet that previously we couldn't do, or at least we tried, and it was a whole lot harder. And so that inspired this work of trying to understand how the internet is changing political organizing and what political organizing looks like today. So to start out with then, I want to offer a broad characterization of the literature. I would suggest to you that in our understanding of the internet and American politics, there are three competing claims that kind of dominate today. And the first is the claim that the internet has driven the rise of organizing without organizations. That's Clay Shirky's colorful term. It's the subtitle of his first book, Here Comes Everybody. That thanks to Facebook, thanks to Twitter, we don't so much need organizations anymore. There's another book by Jennifer Earle and Katrina Kimport, which talks about organizing 2.0, or the notion that now, thanks to the rise of these tools, now that you can just go to an online petition site and start your own petition, that we don't really need organizations anymore, and so what we know as social movements needs to radically change. The second perspective directly competing with that suggests that it's all just collectivism. That sure, now we don't actually need organizations anymore, but that is a bad thing. That is degrading the public sphere, it's degrading activism, because now people just take these easy acts, they just click like on Facebook, and then they're all done with it. And so this stuff is happening, and it's a bad thing that needs to be confronted. Stuart Schulman has made this argument a couple times. Malcolm Gladwell very publicly made it in The New Yorker. As with any segment of social scientists, we are both frustrated and lucky when Malcolm Gladwell sets his sights on us, because he's going to get some things very poetically wrong, and then we can be frustrated in trying to refute him. But hey, what will we do without him? And then there's a third perspective, which says that actually, ignore it all, not much has changed. That it is still an elite-dominated system. So Schlotzman, Verba, and Brady have, in their new book, The Unheavenly Chorus, looked back at the things that they studied in Voice and Equity and said, you know, actually at the broad level, if we're looking at political behavior broadly, it used to be the case that you didn't really get involved until unless you were wealthy, or you were well-educated, or you were white. And those are sort of the shorthand for it all. And today, thanks to the internet, pretty much all that is still true, but maybe a little bit younger. So they look quite exhaustively and find that not an awful lot has changed. Likewise, my colleague at GW, Matt Heinemann, argues in his 2009 book, Myth of Digital Democracy, that for all the discussion of the blogosphere's influence, of allowing anybody to write a blog post that can be seen by millions, we have power laws. It's actually an elite system in which a remarkable few actually get very much influence. And that remarkable few still tends to be white guys who went to the Ivy League and hold advanced degrees. So not all that much has changed. What I want to suggest to you here is a fourth perspective, which doesn't necessarily tell us that the others are wrong, but says that they're leaving something out. And that is that what I think we're finding more and more is organizing with different organizations. It's not that organizations are now irrelevant, but instead what the internet has done is change the types of organizations that are most prominent in American politics, and the tactical repertoires and membership communications, fundraising and membership, that they make use of. So it's a change within this organizational layer of American politics. We have mass political behavior, we have elite political institutions, and then we have this mediating layer of advocacy groups or interest groups. And it's within that layer that we see the biggest change, but we've seen to date very little research on that topic area. So to illustrate that, the image that's the cover of my book is from the Wisconsin protests. And this is, of course, in the spring of 2011. And the interesting thing is that those happened just a couple weeks, actually, after Egypt, after the beginning of the Arab Spring. And while the Arab Spring has led to several entire journal special issues devoted to the question of, did essentially Twitter cause the Arab Spring? Did the internet cause it all? Nobody looks at the Wisconsin protests and says, Twitter caused that. And the reason is that we've got a ready-made sense of what was going on there. That began as a local response to a state policy dispute. They had a budget shortfall, and into that budget bill, given that the newly elected Republican governor also had a Republican supermajority in the House and the Senate, he said, we're going to go ahead and also curtail public union collective bargaining rights. That part of the long-term reason why we've got these shortfalls is because of collective bargaining, and we're going to put an end to it. And that was viewed by the local unions as a power play. I'll go ahead and say, whether you like it or not, yeah, it's also a power play. You either think it's a good one or a bad one. But importantly, while that started out as this local response, which we basically know how it works out. For the past 20 or 30 years of American politics, the unions, when faced with that curtailing of their rights, have tried to fight, and then they've basically suffered some losses. But what started as that local response, with a little bit of the support from the national unions, very quickly turned into a nationwide issue. And that, I would argue to you, is largely because of the role played by these netroots organizations. It's that's MoveOn.org, that's dailycoast.com, Progressive Change Campaign Committee, Democracy for America, a whole set of organizations founded in the past dozen years or so, which organize in very similar ways to one another. They're what I call internet-mediated issue generalists. And these organizations, within 2 days of seeing what was going on in Wisconsin, pivoted their resources to focusing on a variety of national issues, to focusing their membership on that single issue. And they were able to provide money, they were able to provide volunteers, they were able to provide national attention. Within 2 weeks, a coalition of organizations led by MoveOn organized solidarity rallies at 49 state capitals around the country, about 50,000 people turning out. That nationalizes the issue. That gives the media nationwide a hook to report it in their local papers, what local papers are left at least. And so that plays a central role in the way that that conflict plays out over the next several weeks, and turning into the most prominent example of union mobilization that we've seen in this country in at least a couple decades. If we want to understand moments of contentious politics like Wisconsin, and I think generally as social scientists we do, that's one of the puzzles that we seek to answer, then I think we need to take seriously this new generation of groups and ask how they operate differently from the older ones. So again, when I talk about this new generation, it's not just MoveOn. When I talk about the MoveOn effect, I'm not talking about the effectiveness of MoveOn, but rather the effect that this new type of organization has on the broader ecosystem of advocacy groups in American politics. So the prominent ones that you may have heard of, MoveOn.org, Organizing for America, Daily Kos, Avaz is international. There are, as an aside, a number of MoveOn-style groups in other countries. 38 Degrees in the United Kingdom, Get Up in Australia. I'm starting a new research project that's looking at them, but it's not even in the workshop stage, so ask me in Q&A and I can fumble around for answers. But there's a whole set of organizations, all of them concentrated on the left. And that is something that I cover in the book. I won't cover in the talk today because it makes the talk twice as long, and I think Q&A would be more useful. But I'd be happy to talk about in Q&A that we actually find a surprising lack of similar organizations in the American right. It's not that conservatives haven't tried to start their own MoveOn. They actually very specifically have called it by name and tried to start it almost once a year since 2003, 2004. And they've actually continuously failed in what is a puzzle all its own. We do see conservative blog sites like Red State that mimic Daily Kos, but they're an order of magnitude less popular. So what we've seen is that this new style of organization mostly populates one side of the political spectrum. And for that reason, the book itself, the study, is primarily focused on understanding that side of the spectrum. Again, I'd be happy to tell you more about that in Q&A. So let's take a second now and look more closely at MoveOn. I want to check, how many of you received MoveOn's emails? OK, and how many MoveOn members do we have in the room? OK, so this is the good news, is you get to learn something today. Those of you who had your hand raised, I'd like to congratulate you. You are a MoveOn member. MoveOn has redefined membership from the act of writing a check to the act of being on their list. If you are on a list, they count you as a member. In fact, if you don't immediately delete the next message they send you, if you take a look at it, it'll say right at the top, Dear MoveOn member. But so the organization was founded in 1998. It was actually founded as an online petition asking Congress to censure Bill Clinton and just move on. That petition did go viral. It received about 500,000 people signed it. But it didn't have an effect, as petitions often alone don't have an effect. And so the founders of it then decided to try to start a larger organization. The founders were two people, Wes Boyd and Joan Blades, a couple living in Colorado at the time. They've since moved out to Berkeley. If any of you remember the flying toaster screensaver, yeah, they were the people who built that. And their company, Berkeley Systems, they then sold that and became millionaires there in that way. And then with time to spare, they decided to start this organization. That actually ends up being important because an awful lot of what makes MoveOn unique is them adapting organizational strategies that come out of the Silicon Valley tech community. So they founded in 1998. They don't really become the big organization that we know today until they have the Iraq War to organize around. And in organizing around that and becoming one of the main hubs for organizing around the Iraq War, their membership built to about 3.2 million members, and they became a household name. I was in response to that, they had things like the famous full-page New York Times ad calling David Petraeus, David Betray Us. In case you're curious, yes, every MoveOn staffer from that time has heard your Twitter joke about David betray us in light of the news from a couple months ago. They've all heard that joke at least 7 times. But today they have over 7 million members. In the 2008 election, those members donated over $90 million to Obama and to help elect other candidates, mostly through MoveOn. And they volunteered nearly 20 million members amongst almost 1 million different volunteers. So while these are members who often don't realize that they are members of the organization, they do an awful lot of things. They volunteer a lot of time, they engage an awful lot, and not only through clicking. They also have about 200 locally based MoveOn councils. MoveOn Council is at least 4 MoveOn members who live in the same area and have agreed to engage in more local activities. So they organize local events, they organize house parties, they in general try to take the activism beyond simply clicking on petitions. They achieve all of this, and this is where it gets interesting, with about 40 staff people, and actually after the recent election they've restructured a bit and now they have about 30 staff people, and no office space. That's a policy that they take out of the tech community called radical decentralization. MoveOn staffers work mostly at coffee houses. They can work out of home offices, but there are no MoveOn offices, which means that all the work is done via conference calls or via Google Hangouts. They are constantly on GChat with each other discussing the next petition that they're about to launch. So it's a very different organizational structure, which requires far fewer resources. You have much lower overhead if you just don't have any office space and therefore don't need an office manager. What they do with with all this stuff, this is just one brief example, but in the 2010 healthcare legislation, MoveOn spent a lot of time first organizing around the public option, trying to get a stronger healthcare bill through. And then they reached a point where they were at the end game of that, and it was going to come down to a vote. And the question was, were senators going to block it, in particular people like Blanche Lincoln? And so they start out by sending out on Thursday, October 22nd, an email to the entire member list titled Official MoveOn Ballot. And that was asking the members, should MoveOn take the stance that any senator or any Democratic senator who votes against the bill, we will support a primary challenger to them. Perhaps not surprisingly, given the people who have decided to join MoveOn, and that's the hard left of America, the following Tuesday they're able to announce big news that 93% of you agree. I know we are shocked that the activist left thinks that Democrats shouldn't shouldn't stop healthcare legislation. But what followed is what makes it interesting. That on the following Monday, you get their announcement of the Healthcare Accountability Pledge. That asked their membership to make a pledge of how many dollars they would be willing to donate to the war chest of a primary opponent to any Democrat who votes against this thing. And by the following Thursday, they had $3.5 million in promised donations. That allows MoveOn's lobbyists to go in for a visit with a Blanche Lincoln or with other wavering Democratic senators and say, listen, there's going to be a cost to you making this vote. If you stand against the president on his signature initiative and against MoveOn members on this initiative, then there's $3.5 million waiting in the war chest for whoever wants to run against you. And that is political power as we as social scientists are used to thinking of it. You know, that is a clear, credible threat that they're able to make, which moves beyond the collectivism that usually gets discussed by the Gladwells and everyone in the world. I should note, MoveOn, again, about a week and a half after the election, announced a pretty dramatic restructuring of their organization. I haven't gotten confirmation of this yet, but I'm pretty sure they did this just to mess with me. I've asked that to several people, and they have not given me a hard denial yet of that. But so they're in the process of redesigning. I'm observing that, and we'll eventually do some updates. But the important elements of the redesign that I think also figure into our understanding of them are 2 innovations that they've made in the past couple of years. And the first is signon.org. Show of hands, who's heard of change.org? Okay, most of you. So change.org is a for-profit company that allows people, that enables us to go and write our own petitions. They also take sponsored petitions from a wide variety of advocacy groups out there, advocacy interests out there. And they use some of the money they raise to hire organizers that help to leverage grassroots petitions up into the national spotlight, or at least the local spotlight. Sign-on is the same model as that, where any MoveOn member can go and launch their own petition, and if it attracts enough signatures, then MoveOn takes a look at it and will consider sending it out to the national membership. And that helps them leverage up, find ideas from the local grassroots and leverage up into national power. The interesting thing about Sign-On is that from our perspective, it's a petition engine. It's an opportunity to go to a site, create your own petition and hope people latch on. From sign-ons, or from MoveOn's perspective, it's an analytics engine. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of these petitions are started there every week. And by observing, they are doing constant analysis of what's getting picked up by that. And through that, finding out what are the issues that our members care most about. What are the things that we ought to be working on, not because it got a lot of clicks because we sent out a big petition that we thought of, but instead, what are the issues that we're seeing in neighborhood after neighborhood are constantly being discussed. And that then leads them to make different decisions. And then the other thing, show of hands, who's heard of Upworthy? Okay, about a half of the rest of you who haven't have nonetheless clicked on Upworthy stuff recently. Upworthy is a new initiative, or new company that seeks to take good, high-quality content and label it in such a way that people will actually click on it through Facebook or through Twitter. And they've been pretty successful, and they've attracted New York Times coverage and coverage from a lot of other places. Upworthy was launched by MoveOn alumni after they experimented with the MoveOn front page. This happened about a year and a half ago. This guy here, a young man named Zach Walls, was the son of 2 lesbians in Iowa. And he had a couple years ago given public testimony to the Iowa State House about that experience in a pretty moving manner. That initially got put online, his testimony, with the title Zach Walls Speaks About Family. And it was moving stuff, so it got forwarded around a bit, and eventually got about 1 million views. MoveOn found this old content and instead gave it the title, 2 lesbians raised a baby and this is what they got. And even though it was old content, within a couple days that attracted 17 million views, making it one of the most watched items in YouTube history. And that clued into them that if they want to compete in the broader media scape, then they want to experiment more with what sort of language works. And so they then launched a company, which is now one of the cutting edge groups doing that sort of work. MoveOn continues to do this sort of work to try to push the edges and find spaces where they can be powerful in the new media environment. They're quite good at experimenting in that manner. But now I want to turn back to sort of the core of what I call the MoveOn effect. So looking back at that one key notion of, oh, we're MoveOn members, but we didn't realize it. This is actually what I call a regime shift in membership regimes. And it's something that has happened before. So Theda Skocpol wrote in 2003 this book, Diminished Democracy. And in it, she describes how an old generation of cross-class membership federations, this is the Rotary clubs, this is the Elks clubs, were replaced by the professionalized interest groups of the 1960s and the 1970s. The single issue groups that dominate Washington, D.C. for the past 30, 40 years. And this is a response to Bob Putnam's Bowling Alone. But what she says is if you want to understand the decline of civic engagement in America, you've got to look at the organizational layer. You've got to look at the organizations. And at the same time that we have this interest group explosion in American politics, we also have a change in what types of groups dominate American politics. That is, as Bruce Bimber argues in a 2003 book, a technologically mediated transition. Part of what was going on there, as membership went from face-to-face engagement, where to be a member of the Elks Club meant showing up at the Elks Lodge and eventually volunteering to be secretary. Another piece of advice, not only to grad students, but to everybody, don't volunteer to be secretary. Don't ever volunteer to be secretary. I'm secretary of like 3 organizations, so I think I can say that. That change, we went from this membership where it was showing up to membership as check writing or armchair activism. And that was a shift that happened in the late 60s and early 70s because the costs of mainframe computing had dropped low enough that nonprofits could make use of it. So nonprofits started sending out big direct mail pieces to Americans, and 1 or 2% of us would write back and with a check. And then we got on their list, and they would then send us mail every year asking their members to write another annual check. And that provided a revenue stream that allowed for these DC interest groups, that allowed for these DC interest groups to build up stable revenue streams that they could then use to hire policy experts, to hire lobbyists, and to concentrate in DC. It's not the only revenue stream that was created at that time. We also had the rise of major donors and foundations that happened to happen right around 1970 as well. But that change in how we define membership enabled the rise of this new wave of groups. We get the types of groups in American politics that we can pay to have, is sort of the short version of what I'm suggesting to you. And that is, again, what we're seeing now as well, that we're seeing a move from this armchair activism to what is sometimes called collectivism. where membership is even thinner than it was before. It's a pretty dramatic drop in what it means to be a member when it stops being showing up and starts being writing a check. Now the new organizations aren't even asking for checks anymore. The odd thing is I'm actually going to suggest to you that in the end, that's a good thing, because the new organizations can hear so much more than the organizations that they're displacing. So this is my big, busy chart, because all social scientists, I was told, were supposed to have big, busy charts. I'm a Roger Smith student, by the way, so you can blame him for that advice. And this is combining what Scotch Paul was suggesting went on in the 1970s with what both Bimber and myself argue was happening most recently. And what I just want to call out for you here, we've got dominant organization types. It changed from the cross-class membership federations to the single-issue groups to the internet-mediated issue generalists. What I want to focus you on, though, is that the big change is just right here, that it's a change in funding streams. We've gone from often relying on direct mail, membership tied to check writing, to online appeals, where the average MoveOn fundraiser is one where they say, hey, did you see what happened in the news yesterday? Or in this case, we make it current, did you see Obama's announcement about Joe Biden and guns yesterday? Click here to learn more about it, or click here to see an ad that we want to put on the air. And if you like it, give us $3 to work on this issue. Give us $3 to put a commercial in the air. So it ends up being very targeted appeals aimed at whatever is happening in the news. That seems like a pretty small shift, particularly when we still have patron donors and grants. What I want to suggest to you is that it ends up being pretty dramatic for the types of organizations and the types of organizing that we see in American politics. So the one last note that I want to make about this membership model, this membership where it's just you are on a list, is that it's fundamentally sedimentary in character. And what I mean by sedimentary mobilization, to take another organization, the Progressive Change Campaign Committee, as an example. That's a MoveOn-like group, started actually by a couple MoveOn alumni and one technologist. That was an organization that was founded after the 2008 election. And the three of them sort of decided they needed another organization. They called themselves Bold Progressives. They wanted to sort of stake out more of the hard left pressure of Obama space. And the first issue that they worked on is they noticed that Al Franken, who had won the Minnesota Senate election by such a close margin that it was tied up in constant legal challenges. And at first that was because legitimately they had to count all the votes again. But it had reached the point by January and February that what was actually going on was Norm Coleman, his opponent, was continuing the legal challenge so that Al Franken couldn't get seated, which is a very strategically savvy move because that denies the Democrats their 60th seat in the Senate. And seeing that, there was a Democratic Party petition. The Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee put out a petition where people could sign it saying, Norm Coleman, please stop holding this up and let him be seated. And Adam Green from the Progressive Change Campaign Committee took a look at that and said, my God, that is a really stupid petition, because Norm Coleman really isn't going to care if Democrats don't like what he's doing. And instead, they launched the Norm's $1 a day fundraiser, where what they did instead was, their ask was, please sign up to give at least $1 a day, or however much a day you want to give, that you will donate every day until Norm Coleman gives up on this stupid challenge. And all the money that we raise will go in a war chest that will be then given to Democratic Senate candidates the next time around. Now, this isn't going to raise hundreds of millions of dollars, but it's going to apply some actual pressure, because that then means that Norm Coleman and company can assess, well, every day we delay is another, let's say, $10,000 raised for our opponents. How much is this delay worth versus how much versus $10,000? And whether it influences Coleman or not, it proves far more attractive to progressive activists and donors. So a lot of people take that action. And when that action then goes away, when Norm Coleman stops being the issue, the Progressive Change Campaign Committee is then left with a member list. So they start with Al Franken, and then they move on to healthcare, and then they move on to the oil spill, or they move on to whatever's in the news. And by tracking the news, by tracking the things that are current and that their potential members want to act on, they pick issues that are more likely to get forwarded around to be taken. And then when that issue wave recedes, they're left with a member list. Since they've defined membership as anyone who's on our list, that means that they can follow issue by issue and be far more effective. So that then changes both the types of tactics they're going to choose and how they select the tactics, and also where they're going to go, what issues they're going to work on. Turning to fundraising then, there's 3 key elements of this MoveOn, generally Netroots model, that I think are important for us to wrap our heads around. And the first is the zero marginal cost of scaling. That if you're starting from direct mail, and the fundraising guides that are given out to nonprofit advocacy groups from the 80s and 90s all say you start with direct mail. But if you start with that, an additional piece of direct mail carries a marginal cost. There's additional printing, there's additional postage, there's additional handling. And so that incentivizes the old issue groups to be single issue groups. Because what you're trying to do is identify a set of people, Defenders of Wildlife is a good example, they have identified a set of people who really care about wolves. And once they've done that, they can then go back to them every year and say, hey, wolves are important, please give again. And they're highly likely to say yes. And that gives them, again, the funding they need to do the work that they want to do. So the marginal cost of direct mail incentivizes you to identify in the country very strong supporters who are highly likely to give. Because otherwise you will bleed yourself dry by sending all that mail. Since email has a zero marginal cost of scaling, or approximately zero, sending your email out to 1,000 people rather than 100, so long as you already have the names, it costs the same amount. Service space is minimal. That means that you're then incentivized to work on a wider array of issues. You want to move to gun politics if you're MoveOn, because that's what people are thinking about post-Newtown. That's what they're likely to act on, and that will then give you the larger list. And what you're looking for, since it's zero marginal cost, is people who will give sometimes. This then gives rise, most importantly, to A/B testing, which I describe as a form of passive democratic input. This is the reason why, at the end of the day, I'm going to suggest to you the new membership model is probably more responsive than the old one. Every message that these organizations send out, before they send it out to the full list, they start by subdividing, taking random subsets of the list, and sending different test messages. And so through this, they're able to test out what headlines are most popular, what issue frames are most popular. Daniel talks about this in his book on the Obama campaign. The Obama campaign tests the size and font of the donate button, and the color of the donate button, even if I remember right. These organizations are doing the same thing, but not only looking at the donate button, but also looking at what issues are most popular with their members. You know, what issues get forwarded around a lot versus what issues lead to lots of people saying, please unsubscribe me. This leads them not only to figure out how should we phrase the issue we're working on, but which issue to choose and which actions to ask people to take. So it ends up informing the activity that they engage in. And it's a form of democratic input because the 7 million members of MoveOn, even though they don't realize that they're being listened to, when they open that email or don't open that email, and when they click on that action or don't click on that action, all of that passive activity at your laptop is getting recorded in their servers for very cheap. And on a day-to-day or hour-by-hour basis, it allows the organization, this is what they're doing better with Sign-On now, it allows the organization to get a sense of public opinion amongst their membership that they otherwise wouldn't have. This was driven home to me when I was discussing the Betray Us ad with one MoveOn staffer, and they pointed out what was lost in the media with that entire scandal is that ad was tremendously popular with our membership. If it wasn't popular with them, if they hadn't funded it, we wouldn't have been able to run it because they're raising money from the membership and then using it to put ads up. So those things that test tremendously well with the membership are the things they're then led to do. It allows them to listen to the membership, even though it's a thin membership, much more effectively than those organizations that are writing once, twice, 3 times per year. And this also then leads them to the practice of headline chasing, which I've already alluded to. That's deciding to work on guns now because of Newtown. That's working on Trayvon Martin last spring because that's what was in the news. These issue generalists don't only work on what happens to be in the news. They try to influence what's in the news too. But an awful lot of what they're doing by design is working on the issue of the day or providing a larger cavalry when something like the Wisconsin protest comes up. And that puts them in a different niche than the older single issue groups that came before them that were mostly hiring policy experts, hiring lobbyists, occasionally hiring organizers, and trying over the course of years to influence the halls of Washington. The reason why this becomes particularly important is because old revenue streams are also collapsing at the same time. Direct mail as a field has, as a lot of practitioners told me, gone off a cliff. And that's for the pretty simple reason that we don't open our mail anymore. We pay our bills online. The decline of direct mail ends up being important because the money that organizations were getting through direct mail was broadly unrestricted money. It was money to support the organization. And so you can take that and use it to keep the lights on. You can take that and use it to pay the human resources department. The money that's being raised online is restricted money. If your fundraising appeal is, here's an advertisement, give us money so we can put it on the air, you can't then take that money and just apply it to human resources instead. That's not a problem if you're MoveOn and you don't have a human resources department. They just have one person tasked with that. She's the COO. But it's a big organization if you're, say, the Sierra Club, which has offices around the country and has to find some way to pay for this infrastructure that they've had for generations. So the netroots groups have low overhead costs. Legacy groups have these high overhead costs that come from the previous era of membership and fundraising. This is Defenders of Wildlife's beautiful, beautiful office, which is near Farragut North Metro in Washington, D.C. That's a gorgeous office, and I know instinctively how they paid for that in the 1980s and 1990s. It's a lot less clear how they pay for that today. Because as fundraising changes from the generally unrestricted direct mail to this online fundraising, they create a gap in between. And so this is one example of it. You might be saying to yourself, right, but don't these old groups send emails too? They do. So in the book, I took some time to look at the types of messages that they send. This is a fundraising message that went out from saveourenvironment.org. These two messages came out on the same day in late December 2008. And Save Our Environment, which is a very old environmental coalition that they've attached a .org name to, says, we have less than 48 hours to reach our goal of raising $10,000. There are lots of reasons why you should give right now. First, because we're counting on you. Second, because the year's coming to a close. Third, because there's no time like the present. My sense is that we probably all have heard this type of fundraising pitch before. This is the pitch that you get in all of that advocacy direct mail that you get when you go home because you got on a list because you donated at one point to some organization and they sold your name to 7 other organizations. But that's the general generic appeal that they've always sent in direct mail, but they're now sending an email. They've taken the direct mail, put it online for the marginal costs. MoveOn that same day said, dear MoveOn member, you've probably heard about how Wall Street financier Bernard Madoff scammed investors out of at least $50 billion. You may not have heard that his victims include the foundations that support some really important progressive organizations. And then they go on to describe the groups and say, we've got a major donor who will match your donations. Please give through us to those groups. Notice that this fundraiser is tied to the events of the day. So it has a higher salience for the recipients of that message, because if you were watching Rachel Maddow last night, as an awful lot of MoveOn members do, then that's something that you were just thinking about, and here they're giving you an opportunity to act. Whereas the old group is just sending out the same old message as before. Now these are just 2 examples, but what I then did was what I called the Membership Communications Project. I signed up for the emails of 70 prominent advocacy groups on the left. Some of them new, some of them old. And then I did basic content analysis on 6 months of the emails that they send out to their supporters. It was about 2,100 emails at all, and therefore it was an awful lot of coffee. And what I found, there was 350 fundraising emails that they sent out. And I content coded these by type. So there's 3 types of fundraisers that I found. The first is the general type, general fundraiser for overhead money. Second is targeted, so that's if there is a specific ask for a specific purpose. The third, a special type, is pass-through fundraising. That's the Emily's List style fundraising of, here's a good candidate, please donate to the candidate through us, so that they know where it's coming from. And the blue bar is new groups, the red bar is old groups. What you find when you look over the course of 6 months is that both groups are doing general fundraisers. The new groups are mostly doing those after some big win. So the 6 months that I was doing this, January to July of 2010, included the big healthcare win. And not surprisingly, every single organization sent out a message saying, yay, we won, by the way, please give to us, we do good work. Not surprising. But the older organizations are almost entirely sending out the old style of fundraiser. Their direct mail department or their fundraising department, which is the same people who did direct mail, are now trying to master email by bringing over the same tools and techniques to the same thing. It's an institutional story. The targeted emails are coming almost entirely from the new groups. And somewhat surprisingly, the pass-through emails, I find this surprising since it was originated with Emily's List, an old group. That red bar is almost all Emily's List. There was one message from League of Conservation Voters. But besides that, it's the only pass-through fundraising being done by older organizations, groups founded before MoveOn, are Emily's List itself, or LCV. And we see the new groups doing this all the time. MoveOn, Progressive Change Campaign Committee, are frequently using as a tactic finding a legislator, asking them to do something good, and then when they do, sending out a message to their membership saying, here's this great legislator, here's what they did, please donate to them to show thanks. That's one of the ways that they try to boost their champions. So what we find here is that it's not that all organizations aren't using technology, but that in fact new groups and old groups use technology in different ways. The other sort of take-home message here relates to disruption theory, which comes from Clayton Christensen. It's his 1997 book, The Innovator's Dilemma. There's, I think, some flaws in how we generally understand disruption theory, but the basic story that Christensen tells us is that when innovation happens, it can be broken into basically two categories. There's sustaining innovations, which are large firms improving upon their existing market. And so the fact that they have large R&D budgets means that those firms usually lead the way. And then there's disruptive innovations, which is when a new market emerges that eventually undercuts the old one. And since it's a new market that's occurring sort of laterally to what the existing groups are doing, that's where you usually see new firms or new startups leading the way. And what we're finding here is in advocacy, as I think we've now pretty much seen in journalism, a disruption story is what we're now starting to tell. So this is something which I think is sort of the now received wisdom of how we understand what's happened to journalism recently. It is not that bloggers killed the newspapers. In fact, if we want to label one person as the one who killed the newspapers, it's probably Craig Newmark from Craigslist. What happened is, and we've got Pablo Baskowski telling us about how the New York Times in the 1990s was actually doing a great job with experimenting online and putting their news online in new formats. Plenty of big organizations with big R&D departments did lead the way on the internet, and that didn't stop what we're now seeing as the newspaper crisis. But instead what happened is you get a new medium, and that leads to completely different emerging markets. Through that, we then see the disruption of revenue streams. The reason why it's Craig's fault is because Craigslist ended up undermining classified ads. He didn't mean to, but that's what ended up happening. And when you disrupt those revenue streams, that's what leads to the decline of old organizations. So the problem for the New York Times or for any other newspaper isn't that no one wants to read it anymore. More people are reading the New York Times than ever before if we count online readership. It's that they are now faced with a tough question of how do we pay for the big beautiful office space in Midtown Manhattan? And that challenge, the challenge of how do we pay for our existing and valued infrastructure in a time where the old revenue streams have disappeared and the new ones are unstable, that's the basic story that we're now telling ourselves about journalism. And the other thing we're telling ourselves about journalism is that if all that happens is we lose the old structure of newspapers, that's probably not such a bad thing. What we care about isn't the newspapers, but particular types of journalism. So in particular, local journalism, investigative journalism, foreign journalism. These are types that we know are public goods, they are valued, and they're also expensive and difficult to produce. They were paid for in the old system because we had stable enough revenue streams that we could pay for a bit of those things. No one ever thought we necessarily had enough investigative journalism. But we were able to pay for some of it. And now in the future, or now in the present, we no longer exactly know how to pay for it. And that, to end on a sort of complicated note, is also the story that I would tell you in the end about the MoveOn effect. Which is similarly, we have now seen the disruption of revenue streams, in particular direct mail. And that's leading to a decline or a problem of decline for existing organizations. That is not a problem if it means that we have fewer single issue advocacy groups in the country 5 years from now. I would suggest to you that we probably had more than enough of those in total. But there are functions that those organizations play for civil society at large. Serving as laboratories of democracy, running trainings for staff and for volunteers, field organizers. One of the things that MoveOn will never be able to do is put an organizer across the table from management and hammer out a labor contract. And so there's an awful lot of public goods that are provided by these civil society advocacy organizations that we probably didn't have enough of before, but we did know how we paid for them. And the moment that we're moving into is one where we have these new nimble organizations that can act as a cavalry around any issue as it rises through the media agenda. But there's also an awful lot of uncertainty for how we pay for expensive but publicly good infrastructure. So to close out, I just want to note, Those of you who are familiar with Bruce Bimber's 2003 book, Information in American Democracy, or if you've read his more recent book with Stoll and Flanagan, might be wondering why this story is different than theirs. And the short version, I'm largely standing on the work that they've done. And the difference here is this disruptive or generational difference. In 2003, Bimber was laying out that he thought, thanks to new information technology, we were going to see changes in the style of membership and even in organizational structure. But the expectation at that time would be that the existing organizations would lead the way. So there were some interesting experiments going on with Environmental Defense Fund where they were trying out using the internet for politics. This is in the late 90s. And that's a bit like what the New York Times was doing with news in the late 90s. However, what we're now seeing is that it's a generational difference. The new organizations and the old organizations use technology differently. And that leads them to these different tactics, to different definitions of membership, to different fundraising, and to mobilize public sentiment around a different range of issues. That's what I think is important about this generational change. And so that's what I give to you here today. That's everything, and I'd love to hear what you want to hear. So thanks. Yeah.
Why can't or why don't or the right-wing groups, why are they much less successful with this than
Right. So yeah, that is, I should note, it's chapter 6 of the book is the long version. The short version is, the theory is out-party innovation incentives. So in short, I reject, there's a theory that's been out there for a long time that the internet is sort of a horizontal medium and progressives are horizontal types, and so it just fits them better. And I argue that we should pretty strongly reject that theory. The basic reason, if we look at American history for one example, in the 1990s, the internet was looking an awful lot like a conservative-dominated medium. The Drudge Report was the dominant online news hub, and freerepublic.com was this message board site that was dominated by hard conservatives that were doing online activism together. Freeping polls is the act of sending a bunch of partisans to mess with an online poll. That's after Free Republic because they invented that tactic. So during the Clinton administration, the internet was seeming like a pretty hard right place. And at the beginning of the Bush administration, we saw either parity or maybe even a little conservative dominance in the blogosphere. And then what we saw is, as the opportunity structure, because we had Bush in office, the opportunity structure lent itself to an awful lot more mobilization against the government by progressives. That yielded the opportunity for MoveOn, for instance, to get big. The opportunity for Daily Kos, the largest progressive political blog, to get big. In general, we know historically that membership, for instance, in environmental organizations, goes up during Republican administrations and goes down during Democratic administrations, because the base that you're trying to mobilize feels more threatened when the other side is in office, and donors are more likely to give money. So it seems pretty clear that actually both sides were trying throughout those years to start organizations. However, the side that was able to mobilize against what the government is doing had more success. That also fits pretty well with what we've seen with the Tea Party, where as soon as Obama takes office, we then see people doing the same types of actions they were trying to do before, but drawing much, much larger conservative crowds in opposition to Obama. And the only thing that had changed in the first weeks of administration was who was in office. And what we've then seen is conservatives, while they haven't matched Democrats on MoveOn or on the blogosphere, they have led the way in the latest wave of online technologies. So on Twitter, which didn't really become something that the public was paying a lot of attention, it got started in 2006, but didn't really become big until 2009. Twitter is conservative dominated. They're stronger on Twitter than the Democrats are. And so we see time and time again that the latest wave of online innovations appears to be tied to the party that is out of power leading the way. There's a lot of structural reasons, a lot of them actually linking with Daniel's work, that I think help explain that because of how the party network turns over when you lose an election and then fire the consultants who lost the election for you. So I get into that a bit in the book, and it's going to be a later book project too. But the short version is that I'm pretty sure it comes down to which party's in power, and the party that's out of power leads the way in adopting technologies. We also see that as an aside. Talk radio, we had Rush Limbaugh on the air in the late 80s, but he actually didn't develop the massive audience. He didn't sort of institutionalize until he had Clinton to rail against. So there's at least a reason for an inkling that this technology story or this technology adoption story works not only for the internet, but probably for other moments in innovative communications technologies as well.
So does that imply that it should balance out now that Obama's reelected?
In a sense. So I wouldn't say that in the MoveOn area it's going to balance out. I don't expect conservatives to build their own MoveOn. It's a nuanced explanation, so it works if I have graphs better. But essentially, an awful lot of the choices, institutional choices, that a MoveOn needs to make, for instance, being able to listen to your membership, that works really well if you already have 3 million members. Because conservatives can join your list, but there won't be enough of them to game the results. After 2008, when Obama got elected, conservatives started a site called rebuildtheparty.com. And they tried to use a lot of those open processes that a MoveOn or a Daily Kos uses in order to support user input and try to build a large community. But since they were starting small and they were saying, let's get big, there's a progressive site called Wonket, which specializes mostly in joking around and messing with people. And so Wonket said, hey, let's have some fun with them. And Wonket is a large enough community that when they attacked Rebuild the Party, the top 2 suggestions that they suggested were things like, what was it? Hire more ninjas. Was the that was the #1 suggestion for what conservatives should do to rebuild the Republican Party. So what you see there, I call that the Merry Prankster thesis. That essentially in the institutional development of an online community, there's an early stage where they need to be open in order to encourage lots of community activity, but openness is also vulnerability if the other side has already massed a large community and might attack you for fun. So what that means is that you end up getting a wave of institutionalization for one side that can't be replicated for the other in that one technology. So instead what you get is whichever side is out of power leading the way for the next wave of technology. So the Democrats weren't able to mess with Republicans in the same way on Twitter because in 2008 Democrats didn't have a big Twitter community and were just figuring it out as well.
That all the Republican messages can fit in 140 characters.
That may be the case, though. You know, I've met an awful lot of Democratic consultants, and you know, just because they're more than 140 characters, I think that's just because they're really wordy. I don't know. Okay, great.
You mentioned about the email marketing and fundraising. So the major source of the emails are basically people going to websites and people volunteering their email addresses at party get-togethers or something like that, or on sign-up sheets. What would you recommend to a political party to build up an email database, since voter records, as you know, do not have email addresses, but they have physical addresses?
Sure. So for American political parties, what they're going to want to do is a lot of the same headline chasing actually that the MoveOns of the world are doing. So I would assume that when I get home today and look through emails from the past 2 or 3 days, I will see a couple of emails about Obama's gun announcement from the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee from the DSCC. If I don't, that'll be a mistake from them because that is what Democrat and Democratic supporters care about. The other thing that I would note is actually the parties have as an advantage the fact that election season is their ball game. So the largest email list out there is still Organizing for America, which was Obama for America in 2008. In 2012, more Americans are paying attention to politics during the last 3 months of election season than at any other time. These groups that I'm studying, they also play during election time, but mostly they're engaging in politics outside of elections. They're the civil society groups that do politics the rest of the time. And so they have the burden, the MoveOns have the burden of most people aren't paying a lot of attention at that point. The universe of potential emails is smaller. But Organizing for America has done a great job of, during those time periods when people are paying attention, making, you know, like if you go to that site, the first thing you'll get is a splash page saying, do you like this candidate? Please sign up here. And that gives them the email address. So you can do stuff like that during times. I mean, always the general rule is to think as a sedimentary organization. So the question they should ask themselves is, what is the wave of attention and how can we surf that wave? Because if they effectively surf it, that's what's going to then yield emails.
Before I start though, I think the offhand comment about the right always having 140 character messages and then for your Democrats, I think actually is effective for the right because they can hijack words and send the language that then the left adopts without like entitlements versus pay for work.
Yeah. Frank Luntz is an institution. Yeah.
But anyway, this may make me sound old-fashioned or something, but as much as I marvel at the tactics that are being used here in the new landscape, I really wonder where democracy is in terms of deliberative democracy in this instance discussion. Kind of the ideals and the feel-good aspects of democracy. Where have they gone? Because to look at A/B testing and its passive democratic process is so cynical. It's not democracy in the sense that I would.
Right. So there's two things going on there. First, I'd point to Diana Mutz's work that shows that there's a trade-off between deliberation and participation. And these organizations, the tools they've built, are definitely participation-heavy versus deliberation-heavy. There are times when organizations like MoveOn engage in serious deliberative practices. In particular, after every election cycle, what they've done since 2006 is organize a series of house parties and online deliberations where people will come together, discuss what issues the organization ought to take positive action on. And then after discussing that face-to-face, they put those online with explanations for why they think that's important. And rather than just A/B testing, they then invite everybody to take a look, select the issues and the reasons that are most important, and use that to help forge their agenda. So they've been trying things with deliberation for a while, though I think you're right, it's mostly participation heavy. They also have actually a structural problem, which I think shows up a lot with the advertisements that they choose. Jon Stewart several times has taken MoveOn to task for being just way too out there for his taste. And the problem is that if your membership base are the partisan left, or if a right-wing MoveOn got started, it would be the partisan right. People most likely to take part in politics, and so it's a fraction of a percentage of the American public. And if we think of American public opinion as a bell curve, which it may or may not be, but that would then say that you're drawing your membership from the tails of the bell curve. When you then do A/B testing to find the median opinion of that, you're going to be pretty far away from the median opinion of the median voter in America. And so that's part of the reason why at times you'll get these advertisements, or let's say Betray Us, for instance, deeply, deeply popular with the activist left that is saying, yes, we want to be represented, we want to be heard, and that's what we like, but also completely out of step with the average public opinion. And so that ends up being a problem for the organization to try to work its way around, to try to find some way to take those blinders off. Beyond that, I mean, there's a general polarization story that we've been watching unfold in America for years. What I'd suggest to you, I don't think that the blogs and these online advocacy groups are the central cause of polarization, but they sure ain't helping. They're taking advantage of that polarization because polarization is good for participation. And they're leaning more towards participatory democracy than deliberative democracy. That said, I also think philosophically it comes down to a matter of taste. In my moral conception of what a healthy democracy is, yeah, we need some deliberation, but mostly I think what ails us is nobody showing up, nobody engaging, particularly beyond voting. So I personally like that we're starting out by getting more people engaged in politics, even though if they're a fraction and they're small, and then hope we can find ways to also get them to deliberate and listen to each other afterwards. But then there are a lot of theorists like Fishkin who want to start with deliberation and then work out the participation problem later.
I want to talk to you a little bit about sort of how you describe this as a very thin membership. And can you talk a little bit about, do you think it's uniformly thin, or is there sort of a clear distribution of a group of people that is always going to give money, or even if it's a small amount of money, always going to give money, always going to click to tell their senator, if they're Tom Harkin, that they're awesome, and if they're Chuck Grassley, to go screw them.
Yeah.
And what's your vision and take of how that membership looks in these organizations compared to these more traditional old school direct mail?
Sure, yeah. So actually, I should note, Bimber, Flanagan, and Stoll's book answers that question directly. Right. If you haven't read it yet, that's
why I'm asking.
Right. So yeah, it's a great book. I've talked with Bruce about it a little bit on that particular topic. It is a little hard for me to answer directly because I can tell you for a fact that these organizations do track that and model that data. They have an answer to that question. It's not a question that they share with public scholars who are going to report public results. So I don't know what their actual numbers answer is. In general, membership is, the different types of membership that they describe in their book are ones that come from the member's perspective. So the more you want to do, the more you can do. And that's certainly true for MoveOn. And of MoveOn's 7 million members, the ones who engage in greater participatory acts or engage very frequently or engage offline is in the tens of thousands, I think, or maybe the low hundreds rather than in the millions. So it's a small percentage for them. It's also a small percentage, and I think probably a smaller percentage for the older groups. But pretty quickly we get into areas where the organizations can collaborate and share data and try to find something, but they haven't shared it with me, and there's also an awful lot of tests and experiments you'd have to run to get a good answer. So that's sort of like, there's a set of questions that ought to emerge through collaboration between me, Bruce's team, and these organizations with all their data, which I would love to do and will probably never happen. But I think that's the only way to answer the question well. Yep.
I was going to pursue your revenue stream thing a minute, and let's see if I would make the argument that it may be even more fundamental than you point out. Let's say newspapers, for example. I would argue that newspapers feature an agenda, a community agenda in place, and that network television, radio is the same thing, magazines, and space is kind of like space, the internet. But in the case of newspapers, take them for example, they went into decline in the early 20s in terms of market penetration. In the case of television, you look at it, they went into decline in 1981. I mean, in the case, so by the time the revenue streams came along to challenge them, they're already much weaker than the way they were. So I would argue that it's not so much the revenue stream that's undermining them, although clearly it is that it's the audience has shifted its focus